Into it. So welcome everyone to our Congreso Just Recovery Workshop. I'm your MC, Ernesto Arevalo, with Communities for a Better Environment. And for this 1-hour workshop, we'll learn about the Just Recovery Framework and how to use it in our local and statewide organizing and advocacy. So I'll pass it off to Alexis.
Great, thank you so much, Ernesto. Let's see, I'm seeing some blue lines on my screen. Is that on others? Just making sure. But totally fine. Hi, everyone. Thanks again. Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining this workshop. My name is Alexis. I go by she, her, and I'm a program associate at CEJA. I'll be co-facilitating this workshop with Katie, Katie Valenzuela. Do you want to introduce yourself, Katie?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Katie. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Policy and Political Director for CEJA based in Sacramento.
Awesome. Thanks. So we're so grateful that you made this time today to spend with us as we engage in collective learning, thinking, and strategizing for a better world that we all really want to finally see through, you know? And the purpose of this workshop is really for participants to gain a stronger understanding of the Just Recovery Framework and learn how it can be a tool to achieve the long-term and systemic change for our communities. So what we aim to do is learn about the background and the history of just transition and just recovery and how they relate to each other. We also really hope to empower each other with ideas and strategies on how to use the Just Recovery Framework to advance environmental justice in our local and statewide work. So now I kind of want to lead into a quick Zoom poll before we get started on just understanding kind of a temperature check on where we're all at with this term. So soon you'll see a Zoom poll pop up and it's going to ask, how clear is your understanding of the Just Transition or Just Recovery Framework? And go ahead and take a few seconds to answer that. And then we'll review the results. All right, we'll give it another few seconds. Awesome, so let's see. So it seems as if a lot of people are mostly clear on it, which is good. We have some who are very clear, and then we have around, 28, we have about a quarter of people who are somewhat clear or not clear at all. So definitely some variance in our understanding with this term, and that's completely understandable given how many different ways it has been used and in so many different contexts. So we're really hoping that this workshop can bring some clarity to that. Now I really want to introduce our 4 panelists that we have today, who in a little while we will hear from, and we're so grateful that they're providing us with their time today. So I want to let us all know that today we're really fortunate to have Ami Rival. You can maybe wave on the Zoom if you want, who is a 2nd-generation South Asian American born and raised on the East Coast and currently a senior policy analyst at AAPI. Through her role at AAPI, she offers an environmental justice and health equity lens to climate and energy policy in California. We'll also be hearing from Antonio Diaz, if you want to wave wherever you are, Antonio, the organizational director at Poder, who has been active in the movement for environmental and economic justice since the early 1990s, and he's currently on the steering committee of San Francisco Rising, Bay Rising, and here at CEJA. We'll also be hearing from Joysha Duda, who is a tri-coastal Bengali American interdisciplinary artist, cultural organizer, and pop ed facilitator. She's co-founding member of Another Gulf is Possible collaborative, and she is also on the steering committee of the Climate Justice Alliance. And finally with us is Julia Jordan, who is a policy coordinator at the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability and works with state-level allies and partners on policy advocacy to ensure participatory and equitable policies and processes for California's most vulnerable communities. So I'm so excited to hear from all of them very soon. But before we get into our panel—
Okay, pero ya...
Sorry, is that someone? Okay. Before we get into this amazing panel, I first wanted to ground us in this moment and what it really means for our communities. So as you all know, we are facing one of the biggest public health crises of our lifetimes, which has hit working class and communities of color the first and worst. In yesterday's workshop titled COVID-19 and Environmental Justice, a lot of y'all were on that. Participants discussed in their breakout rooms the many challenges associated with COVID-19. And for example, some of those problems were disproportionate health impacts on our communities, how many folks are behind on bills now, the digital divide, and the many different barriers to really participating in the public process right now. But participants also expressed the many ways in which communities are protecting themselves and generating community resilience. And if we go to the next slide, we can see a few examples of that, which include mutual aid programs to distribute groceries, medicine, and other essential items, cash assistance programs, supporting local businesses, and caring for our mental health. So these local and people-powered actions provide urgent relief, and they also further reveal systemic inequities that create vast injustices. All of this helps us reimagine the systems change that we need, and it builds our power for long-term systemic change. So in other words, this crisis, with its many challenges, also holds a lot of opportunity to expedite and galvanize the movement to a regenerative future. As the Zapatistas have said, another world is possible. Otro mundo es posible. Grace Lee Boggs and Maria Mize have also added to this, saying another world is necessary, another world is possible, and another world has already begun. So in the next slide, we'll see that this is why so many of our communities right now in the heat of COVID-19 are demanding a just recovery from impacts of failing systems that are triggered by COVID, also the economic recession, and from centuries of systemic racism, heteropatriarchy, and extractivism. As the Climate Justice Alliance writes in their explanation of just recovery, a just recovery resists disaster capitalism and instead embraces disaster collectivism, which includes people-powered, heart-centered, socially just relief, as well as the long-term organizing and actions that reclaim the right of peoples to define their economies and govern their communities. Although many are using this term just recovery, to refer to recovering from the pandemic, we also want to point out that just recovery also has a much longer history. And we're fortunate to have with us today Joycia Duda from the Climate Justice Alliance, who can provide us with a little more background on this term. So go ahead and take it away, Joycia.
Thanks, Alexis. Thanks, CEJA, for inviting me to be here. My name's Joycia. I go by she, her. I am a co-founder of Another Gulf is Possible collaborative, which is a collaborative of Brown folks across the Gulf South, from Brownsville, Texas to Pensacola, Florida. And the genesis of the term just recovery actually comes from our region, from the organizing that has been happening for many, many years as a result of necessity, due to being a place that is continually impacted by climate disaster and has been suffering from the long-term disasters of colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy, the legacy of the period of slavery in our country, and then continued Jim Crow. It's the largest population of incarcerated people live in the state that I live in, which is in Louisiana, New Orleans. So, this idea of just recovery comes from climate disaster work, but I want to emphasize that the concept really goes to the root of our recovery from these deeply entrenched systems of oppression. Next slide. So 2017 hurricane season was a really active hurricane season. There have been people who have been organizing across the Gulf South in very grassroots ways for many years. And so when Hurricane Harvey was approaching, we didn't know, you know, when these hurricanes come to our region, we don't know exactly where it's going to hit. There are emergencies, especially when big storms are coming, people get together and start to talk about how we're going to support each other. And so as Hurricane Harvey approached, it seemed it was going towards Houston. We started getting on calls nights prior, days prior to the hurricane hitting, so that when it came, we would be prepared. Those of us who were not in the impacted region in Houston would be able to support those who were. And in particular, Brian Paras, Juan Paras, and the folks at Tejas were the group that we were working directly with, but also trying to uplift and highlight other groups across the region that are not the Red Cross, right? That are not the institutions that do not help those that are the most vulnerable. And we were trying to aggregate those resources. So there was both a way for folks who needed the resources, needed direct support to find it, and folks who wanted to give money and resources to groups that were on the ground to find that. So over the course of a few days, that website went quickly viral, and I think ended up going to like maybe 300,000 hits in almost every country across the world. Next slide, please. And so, you know, that's really the term just recovery. We used it as a hashtag. We were using it as a way to find the work that was really on the ground. The just recovery framework was born from that idea of us supporting people directly, mutual aid, direct person to person, because the government and big NGOs do not help us. And so when 2017 Hurricane Irma was coming, I was actually in Cuba, and there was, you know, it was striking to see the difference in how people in Cuba responded to how people in the US respond when hurricanes come, because they have the infrastructure to deal with disasters, and they have the mutual aid infrastructure embedded within their institutions, within their government. And so it was really striking for me to weeks later be in a place and see such a huge difference in how there was a response in terms of government. Next slide. And September 20th, 2017, we know Hurricane Maria hit Boriken, and that has a long-lasting legacy, and I think really cemented this concept of just recovery, because there was an immediate need for people to come to each other's aid, and we saw that happening via the Centros de Mutuo Apoyo, via all kinds of support that diaspora provided to the island as well. Next slide. So this concept of just recovery is really started from this concept of climate disaster, but obviously now we can apply it to the pandemic, that we move from the status quo, which is an aid, extract, and displace model, where you provide aid in insufficient ways, then extract from the people who have been hit by this disaster, and then long-term displacement. We see that, have really seen that in New Orleans, where I live. We see that now happening in Puerto Rico. We see that happening place after place. The idea of just recovery is for us to move to a place where we can respond directly to the needs of those who are most impacted and vulnerable through mutual support, mutual aid, that we can recover from these disasters, get the resources and support for everybody to get back to work and into their homes, and in this case, in the pandemic, healthy, and then long-term rebuild so that communities are stronger and more self-determined at the end, instead of displaced and further taken from. Next slide. And all of this is within the concept of just transition. So really this idea of moving from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, this is a diagram from our folks at Movement Generation. It's within that whole concept, right? We're not trying to replicate the patterns of extraction, which is what disaster capitalism does, but in this concept of disaster collectivism and this idea of mutual aid, we're trying to create regenerative economies when disaster strikes or when pandemics hit. Next slide. And so ultimately, you know, we see just recovery as just transition. They are really interconnected concepts because these continuous disasters of fires, floods, hurricanes, tsunamis, tornadoes, earthquakes, and now pandemics impact, and we see this so much right now with COVID-19, our energy, food and water, transportation, healthcare, goods and services, education, right? All of the things that make our lives go, these disasters impact and affect. So if we can take a just recovery approach, we move towards and into a world more towards what we want to live instead of further oppressed and taken advantage of, which is the capitalist instinct. So that's what I got for this part.
Thanks so much, Joycia. That was great. That was so helpful to hear about, to learn about, especially since just transition and just recovery now are frameworks that are used so much throughout the environmental justice movement. So thank you for providing that background and that context. Yeah, I wanted to just finish off this portion before leading to our panel by showing that at CEJA, we unite the powerful local organizing of our members in the most impacted communities to fight environmental racism and create opportunities for change at a statewide level in California. And we really, in a lot of ways, are really tied to following this just transition model. Some examples of this are, you know, how we've tried to stop the bad by advancing AB 345, which would have provided a 2,500-foot setback from oil and gas sites. Unfortunately, this bill was stopped this week, but again, the fight continues on this. And CEJA is also supporting AB 2054, which would expand and promote community-based responses to emergency situations as alternatives to armed law enforcement officers. And we're also helping to build visionary, innovative, and new solutions, for example, through AB 310, which would create a state public bank to better serve loans to small businesses in communities who need them most. And also being a co-sponsor of the bill that created SOMA, which, you know, we just went over that workshop. SOMA brings so many benefits to EJ communities in the form of solar, savings, healthier homes, and clean energy jobs. So again, through our collaborative and community-based actions, we really hope to create long-term systemic change that brings justice to our communities. And now to explore how some of our members and our allies are doing this and using the framework to advance environmental justice, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Katie to begin our panel discussion.
Great, thank you, Alexis. I'm gonna begin this 20 minutes or so with some questions for our panelists, but I hope that you all will take some time to put questions you might have into the chat, because we're hoping to spend the last 5 or 10 minutes or so answering as many of those questions as we can. But to start us off, I'm gonna begin with a question for all of the panelists. Now that we've heard this background and context on what just recovery means, what does just recovery actually look like in your community and across EJ communities? So if you could, each of you take just a couple minutes to answer that question, and whoever would like to go first can start us off. Or I could pick somebody. How about Antonio?
Thanks, Katie. I was waiting to see if someone else of our esteemed panelists wanted to jump in. So hi, everyone. Antonio with Poder in San Francisco. Buenos dias. I guess it's still morning. Wow. So what does just recovery look like? I mean, I think Alexis pointed out some of what's happening now, like for example, what Poder is doing and others are doing in terms of meet the immediate need around mutual aid, you know, these practices of growing food together, launching funds like the Undocu fund that we have here in San Francisco, you know, organizing to cancel rent and mortgages. I mean, I think investing in practices that are meeting the immediate need. But I think also what we need to do is invest in what's going to make our economy healthy for everyone. You know, I think we don't say that we want to bounce back to where we were, because our communities were not doing well before these current crises. we want to bounce forward, right? By, for example, investing in green jobs to electrify our buildings and lower our city's carbon footprint, to invest in a public transportation that's not only free but safe, invest in education and also tackling the digital divide, and doing things like dismantling investor-owned utilities that rely on fossil fuels, and exerting community control and a decentralized grid, so like the Reclaim Our Power campaign is doing. I think that these are things that are moving right now, but I think with a deeper investment, we can really deepen the just recovery that our communities need.
Thank you, Antonio. Julia, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, so, I think the principles for what a just recovery looks like is really similar, I think, to a lot of the things that many of us have been advocating for a long time, right? And we sort of mentioned that earlier too, that a lot of this it's not necessarily new. It's just that there's a different kind of urgency, and there's a different level of priority around some of these issues that come up. But I think for us, for Leadership Council and the communities that we work with, we've really thought about, how do we put into practice many of those principles that we have in the work as we look to a recovery from not just COVID, but also the multiple kinds of injustices, white supremacist culture and practices that exist, by following the lead of communities of color and low-income communities, making sure that we're building decision-making power. So there's a very clear need, I think, to meet these basic needs. And then at the same time, I think Joycia mentioned there's this long-term aspect to just recovery as well. It's simultaneously doing mutual aid, ensuring that there's investments going to help with PPE or with economic relief. And at the same time, there's this very long-term strategy around how do we build some of those structures that are going to be new, that are going to bring us into another kind of era that we want to get to. It involves, recognizing that clean air, clean water, healthy food, safe, affordable housing, healthcare are basic human rights. It involves prioritizing those investments that meet basic human needs, sort of looking at not just, how do we rebuild an economy around sort of a post-COVID world, but what does it look like to, to think about basic needs as something, water and wastewater, housing, as things that are deeply embedded in building in a new world, and valuing those as just as much as some of the more traditional economic development projects and programs that I think a lot of the government and state and local officials are going to focus on in this time. And then also, avoiding what we call sort of false solutions to a lot of the issues that we see. So making sure that we're not just doubling down on, fossil fuel industry bailouts and investments in industries that are not uplifting workers, that are degrading the environment and the quality of life for many of the communities that we work with. And then really, what does it look like to develop those local and regional economies that folks actually want to see, right? And how do you kind of create these self-determined, resilient, clean, economies and communities where there are safe and quality jobs, where we're transitioning away from extractive practices, where they are very place-based and responsive to the geography and the community and the neighborhood, and that are accessible to all people in, to everyone, really. So that would be, I think, kind of from a high level, what I would say in terms of, the principles and what we need to focus on for a just recovery.
Thank you, Julia. Lots of props for the false solutions comments in the chat over here. Ami, would you like to go to?
Yeah, thank you, Katie. And hi, everyone. I'm Ami with APEN. I use she, her pronouns. I would just echo what's sort of already been shared. I think for APEN, and I think most of, all of our CEJA groups, what we've reinforced is that we need to be centering grassroots leadership as a model for what a just recovery looks like. And in fact, our communities are incredibly resilient and offering kind of models for what our decision makers should be implementing at the local, regional, and state level. And for us, when we say frontline and grassroots leadership, in this moment, it has very much looked like responding to the immediate needs of our communities and ensuring that our folks have the capacity and the support they need to continue to guide orgs like APEN in the way we scale up solutions. And so Alexis highlighted we had an emergency mobilization fund that we put together early in March when shelter in place hit. And we were able to reach out and activate supporters and fundraise significantly for our members and the broader Asian American and immigrant and refugee community in our bases who've been hit hardest by the virus, the economic shutdowns, as well as the growing anti-Asian racism that's spreading across the country. And so that's just some kind of like local context that was really important to respond to and uplift as it relates to mutual aid. And we've been able to really practice an integrated leadership model based off of years of our leaders being decision makers in the policies that impact their daily lives. And the board that's in charge of distributing those funds features staff from across APEN, our community leaders, as well as allies. And so I think one thing to really hit home is that part of a just recovery is really scaling up those grassroots decision-making models and shifting resources away from sort of how they're currently being allocated and really redefining who we think about as experts. And part of that, I think, is really modeled by the California Green New Deal policy that APEN has been working on for the past year. And we're hoping within that campaign, we can really address historical wrongs, prepare for a just future, and really center frontline leadership.
Excellent. Thank you, Ami. Joysha, I will turn to you to talk about, you covered this in your comments, but around what this looks like, but I think just to further drive home what those critical elements are of just recovery as well, and how you see that result relating to just transition in our communities.
Sure. I think in particular New Orleans, there has now been, 15 years of recovery. Hurricane Katrina was 15 years ago at the end of this month, and it has not been just. However, in the wake of kind of the unjust conditions of extraction that folks have been subjected to, displacement, gentrification, complete privatization of our school system, there has also been simultaneously, because of need, networks of mutual aid and support that are really showing up right now in ways where, and I personally have actually not been home due to my own personal crisis with my family, but from what I am understanding and keeping in touch with at home, there's mutual aid networks that are supporting the houseless. There's mutual aid networks that are supporting those who are undocumented. There are mutual aid networks that are supporting the disabled. And New Orleans is a really actually small city. It's about 360,000. It was 450,000 pre-Katrina, so we're still nearly 100,000 people less. Yet there is infrastructure to take care of each other in a way that I don't see in some bigger cities. And particularly, I lived in Oakland. I lived in California for almost 10 years. I still love California. And there's a relational way of being that I feel like the other coasts are starting to catch up on, in a way that people in the South have had to create because, again, of need. And now we're seeing that model start to kind of replicate everywhere, which is beautiful and wonderful. And I think in terms of just transition and this idea of us moving from extraction to regenerative economies in our work, in our value systems, in our governance systems, we have to start at that really micro small level where we know our neighbor, we know our community, we know, the person down the street needs dialysis. So when the power goes out, I'm gonna go check on that grandma, right? Like, we need that. And so much of our big cities and has taken us away from that humanity, our ultimate humanity that we need to take care of each other and get away from that extractive economy that is based fundamentally on a factory system, an industrialized system, an anonymous system. So the more that we can personalize, know each other, the fact that, when I go to the grocery store and it takes me 15 minutes to get through the line because, people are talking to each other. On the other coast, I grew up in New York and I lived in, people get annoyed, but that's just the way things are. And so I think there's also an element of that being a just recovery. Our relationships are part of just recovery. And that is also part of just trend. It's not just about energy and solar panels. And I think that's this moment of reckoning. I think people are realizing that just transition doesn't just mean we switch from fossil fuels to solar panels and wind, right? It's not just about that. It's about the power that drives our hearts, our beings, right? Our humanity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joysha, for those words. Ami, I will turn back to you now to talk about a two-parter approach here, both what can communities be doing to push for just recovery, both at the state level with our legislature, our administration, and at the local level, and then what should our political leaders be doing to help us in this time?
Yeah, thanks for that, Katie. Right now, I think we're seeing our state decision makers, to start there, they're very much prioritized on addressing the immediate impacts of COVID-19 on our communities. And so they're strategizing as we speak on short and longer term solutions for economic recovery and addressing those immediate health and social and economic impacts. And that's rightfully, I think, the main focus. And so in the immediate term, I think what we're trying to amplify at the state level is that the state needs to make proactive investments in building the capacity of working class communities of color to respond. And those are solutions that really center public health. They center social infrastructure and cohesion, as Joysha was talking about, and center the economic well-being for the longer term. But we know that crisis is a threat multiplier for inequality. And this pandemic has just revealed to us the systemic inequalities that have been burdening us for generations. And so we know that in addition to that sort of immediate term response, we need to be intentional about supporting communities in the longer term and make sure that our policies are ensuring that everyone has a stable home to shelter in, hot water and electricity, the ability to vote safely, environmental health protections, and increased opportunities for economic security. And so it's this play between the current immediate needs and this longer term vision. And so I'll get to this in a little bit. It's been hard to kind of, amidst this digital environment, reach our decision makers and really advocate and organize as we usually do. The way we build power is through, showing up and visibilizing our stories. And it's been really challenging to do that. And so the question becomes, how do we amplify those values, that our vision, and make sure that our decision makers are really hearing from us? And that means that we also have to navigate this new environment within sort of the advocacy realm. And it's being innovative and creative, as we already have been, to meet this current context.
Absolutely. And I know we'll go back to talking about some of those barriers and strategies in a moment. But first, I know a lot of folks on the panel do a lot of direct state policy work, like Ami was talking about. So I wonder if we could speak a little bit about some examples of what campaigns and legislation are working on right now at the Capitol to try to help pursue a just recovery. So maybe Julia, if you want to start us off on that.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, just wanted to also echo what Ami said about the importance of that sort of the shift that's happening right now in terms of virtual organizing and engagement, both with, you know, the folks we work with community members, with local jurisdictions, and also with the state. And there's, you know, different degrees of access that different people have, that in itself is definitely an inequitable situation, you know, that we're working on that as well. So you know, a lot of looking at what this moment is doing to you know, democracy and the democratic process is a very important thing. Making sure that residents have the capacity, the tools, the broadband connectivity to participate in some of those things. But, you know, I also wanted to just, you know, when we talk about, I think, just recovery, or really kind of even just transition, I think there's often like, you know, Trisha was saying, there's kind of this focus on energy, solar panels or whatever, oil and gas. And while that's critical, I think, you know, there's all these other aspects of it as well. And there's also other areas. And so one of the things that we're also working on is looking at making sure that agriculture is also included in this work. So a lot of the areas we work are rural, in the San Joaquin Valley and the Eastern Coachella Valley. We work with folks who are farm workers, who were farm workers, whose families are working in the fields, or in other parts of the food industry. And we also want to think about the transition look like away from sort of this chemically reliant agricultural industry towards a newer vision, right? And to something that many would call agroecology. And so, you know, it's really about, it's broader than just sort of practices. It's also about sort of interacting with land and food and community in a way that honors Indigenous knowledge, that honors the labor of people who are working, that also builds political power of disenfranchised communities. And so, you know, and there's a lot that I could also say about sort of the way that farm workers have been characterized as essential in this time. I think we know there's some, I think, conflicting messaging around that in terms of our priorities in making sure people are taken care of, and also the ways that how do we, by calling them essential, in some ways unintentionally justify their deaths, right? Justify that these are people who have to show up to work, and so we're justifying that they're being exposed to COVID. So that's another thing I'll save for another day. But you know, I wanted to just also mention in terms of the full solutions, one of the big things we're working on that kind of gets at this intersection of agriculture and energy is dairy digesters. And so for some of you who've heard me or others at Leadership Council talk about this, they're basically a technology that you know, relies on really, really massive industrial dairy farms in order to produce energy in the form of gas that's created from basically cow manure. So this is right squarely in that space where we'd say, this is a false solution. You know, this is something that is still requiring massive industrial, you know, confined animal operations where there's heavy water pollution, there's air pollution, there's odor, there's trucking that's going in and out of communities nearby that's polluting the air. You know, folks really who live around there are sort of struggling with that, and yet creating an opportunity for them to make money off of that and call it a climate solution. You know, that's really unacceptable. So that's one of our main campaigns that I think falls within this, in terms of not sort of, you know, doubling down on these, spending money on these types of technologies and just lining the pockets of developers, but how do we really direct that towards communities and what's really needed, and targeting investments, right? So I'll stop there.
Absolutely, especially because we have less money to target, so better get
Exactly.
to the thing we really need, right?
Exactly.
Ami or Antonio, do you have other campaigns you'd like to add in and tell people about?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things that we worked with CEJA on last year was the AB 857, the legislation around the public bank. You know, Poder had actually been involved in local efforts around public banking even prior to that, but worked on this effort to make it easier for municipalities to launch public banks. That is a bank that's local, that's more accountable to the community that they're rooted in, that keeps the monies in community, in the city, not in Wall Street banks that are investing in fossil fuels and prisons and the things that are actually making things worse for people and the planet. So, you know, we've been involved in those efforts this past legislative session, this current one around AB 310, but also moving the issue locally. San Francisco is sort of poised to be one of the first cities to have a public bank. And, you know, we see that as a fundamental component of a just transition and building a local healthy living economy. So that's one of the key things I would say that we've been uplifting locally and statewide with CEJA, APEN, and other partners. And I think it's important. I think the points that Julia has been raising around beware of the false solutions. You know, I think that too often, especially in in a country and in a society, I guess I should say, in which there's always the capitalist imperative to, you know, sort of to drive for a profit. There's too many, you know, corporate-led false solutions around climate that that aren't really a just transition, much less a just recovery. You know, so unless, you know, issues around how we are powering our communities literally with electricity, right? Unless there's an equity approach and a justice approach, we know who's going to benefit and who's not. So I think that you know, we need to be really clear that what we're doing is rooted in analysis of our communities who are hit first and worst should benefit from the transition.
Absolutely. Ami, would you like to add any more?
Yeah, I'll add something to highlight as a resource in terms of how we're engaging with our state decision makers right now, is a letter that APEN worked on in partnership with our allies, including Scope in LA, who's a CEJA member, Greenlining, as well as other partners, to really outline what our demands are to achieve a just recovery in California. And we had over 100 organizations across the environmental sector, transportation, clean energy, and other sectors sign on. And I think that was really powerful to see so many sectors come together to say this is a comprehensive set of demands that are really moving this vision forward. And I want to name, the letter really covers 3 domains. One is operationalizing racial justice. 2 is making green investments that address environmental pollution and climate change. And 3 is promoting workforce development and economic recovery. And I name those 3 because I think what in our letter and in our advocacy, what we're saying is that these 3 things don't have to sort of happen or they're not at odds with each other. And in fact, a just recovery is about meeting that triple bottom line. And it's imperative we see the economic and sort of labor perspective, the environmental vision alongside racial justice as all interconnected and really a part of our solutions. And so to share some of those examples of the ways we can kind of achieve those simultaneously, I think to speak to false solutions, we know that traditional models of emergency and disaster planning are inadequate. And they typically rely on a militarized response. And amidst this movement for defunding the police across the country, I think a just recovery in the way we respond to crises and disasters must be sort of the place where we're really advancing this vision of moving away from the police and sort of militarized responses and investing in community-led responses that really build and coordinate within the social networks that are already embedded in our communities, with local institutions, with our public sector, to respond to these shock events. One example is something that APEN has really been pushing for, which is community resiliency hubs. And the ways that we're seeing our schools, libraries, park and rec sites serving as critical institutions for providing immediate relief and meeting community needs. And in fact, APEN right now is investing in positioning a youth center in Richmond called RISE to be a resilience hub that, yes, clean energy infrastructure is one part, but as folks have already sort of reinforced, that infrastructure is not the end all be all of what makes this community institution, the youth center, resilient. It may address some of the ways it can deliver services during a power outage, but I think what's innovative about it is our experimentation and sort of implementation of a youth governance model to sort of make decisions about what the services will be as the center is expanded. So I provide that example because, as I mentioned, what we need from our policymakers is that they scale up those innovative solutions that we are already modeling in our neighborhoods. Our neighborhoods have these resilience solutions already, and we just need the resources to scale them and the policies to enable them across the state. And then the last thing I'll just say is I mentioned sort of workforce development, and I think there's been a really rich conversation about the care economy right now and the ways we see care workers on the front lines of fighting this virus, whether that be the healthcare system, our educators, social workers, domestic workers, home care workers, the public sector, nurses, I could go on, right? And these are the folks that are really building resilience in our communities. And so what would it look like to design state level policies that continue to bolster these types of jobs that we know many of our members, are employed in, and also are the ones that are creating solutions within a just recovery. So that's just some of that local detail and texture on the types of solutions we're hoping to enable statewide.
Definitely. And I know we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon just talking about that letter because there was so much good content in that. So I want to pitch to an audience question for all of you to briefly answer, and then I'm going to finish with a question for Joysha. But a couple of folks in the audience have asked about how do we ensure this work is landing with our immigrant communities, and specific strategies and concerns we have regarding making sure that our immigrant neighbors and the folks who are migrating across borders actively as we speak are being taken care of as we work on a just recovery. So whoever would like to start briefly on that answer, go ahead.
I mean, I'll just start really briefly, that one of the things that we sort of in the very beginning of the pandemic, and as there was talk about sort of the federal funding coming, CARES dollars, and other kinds of dollars coming in, there was a really big priority for us on making sure that there was no barriers in terms of whether you're undocumented. And so, there were the relief package included funding, but it was so limited, and folks that were undocumented could not access that full check that the rest of us got. And there was also, even if you were in a married household and you had one person who was and one person who wasn't, you still couldn't get the amount that you needed for your family. So that's sort of one sort of simple thing that we've focused on, is just in every single approach to relief, in every single approach to rebuilding, and envisioning a new economy and world and community, to make sure that there aren't those barriers and there aren't those limitations, and that there is that direct line of decision-making power that's sort of invested into immigrant and refugee communities and non-English speaking communities, that there's translation services at the meetings where these decisions are taking place. And that might be Spanish, it might be Hmong, it might be, you know, other languages depending on the region. So that's one sort of practical thing.
Yeah, I paused when you asked the question, Katie, also because that is our fundamental constituency, immigrant families and youth in San Francisco. So what we do is with the intent of being of service to that community and working together to uplift solutions driven by those most impacted, and often in this economy, and in this crisis, it's been immigrants. So I guess point number one, I mean, the other point, as Julia was pointing out, the relief that's coming, or that came from the federal government, obviously did not benefit, especially the undocumented community. I think that we do not expect any relief of any kind from this administration that has been brutal in its approach to the immigrant community, Latinx and otherwise. So I think that that's why we've had to, you know, really strengthen our local mutual aid efforts, whether it's around providing food to members, launching with Jobs with Justice, the Undocu Fund. You know, the city, to its credit, did step up to provide a stream of funding for undocumented folks and immigrants in San Francisco. Obviously, in California, the state did as well, but it's nowhere near enough funding to meet the need. You know, the Undocu Fund itself, you know, has raised over $1 million here in San Francisco. It's received over 8,000 applications. The minimum amount that's allocated to families is $1,000. That's not going to meet the need of our community. So I think that there's ways in which we continue to organize for having, I guess, related to a previous question. I mean, I think that's where it's important to continuing to organize in community, you know, demand the change. A strategy for change is through elections, having people in office at all levels, local, state, and federal, that are accountable to communities is crucial to this work as well.
Thanks, you too. Now that we are out of time, I do want to give just one quick moment for Joysha, the last word here, because we are in wild times, as we all know, with the pandemic and systemic racism, and just you name it, it's all come to head, as our panelists have talked about. What is your advice, Joysha, for those of us who are trying to organize and connect and advocate for change in this unprecedented moment that we're in?
I think the critical piece, and I feel like it's been touched on throughout this panel by everybody, is the deeply intersectional nature of our crisis right now. You know, it is not only one issue, it is not only one system that's being impacted. So to not get overwhelmed by that, but to be conscious, and where is, I mean, personally, this is like deeply personal opinion, is to find where your greatest strength and contribution can be in this moment, and really give yourself to that, and to not be overwhelmed, like to have trust in our community in this moment, to have trust that we've been building for this moment, those of us who have been doing this work for years and decades in my case, right? And I think other people who are here, we've been doing this. We've been waiting for this moment, and to trust that the folks who we are building with have our backs, and to keep an eye out, but focus in on what you're called to do in this moment. And to really, I think this moment of reckoning, you know, is what you're doing where your heart is it a toxic environment for you, right? Like to be really personal and reflective about yourself so you can give your best, because I don't think it's going to get any better with Biden Harris administration, right? Like we're in for it. We're in for it for a lot longer. And so this is the moment for us to really key and tune into ourselves. And I think there hasn't been a lot of conversation here for, I think, climate and environmental justice, where we don't talk so much about our mental, emotional, spiritual health. But in this moment where we're looking at boxes like this all the time, it has an impact on our mental, emotional, spiritual health. So my advice is really, please take care of yourself, take care of those who are most closest around you, and that will have a ripple effect. Again, going back to what I was sharing about just recovery, about recovering our humanity. And part of that is this moment is trying to dehumanize us. So in every way you can, come back to that and give it your all in the place where it is your place to give it your all.
Beautifully stated. Thank you so much, Troisha, and to all of our panelists. I'll pass it back to Alexis to close us out.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks everyone so much. That was so enlightening, so motivating. I'm so inspired, and definitely heard such great insight from our panelists, you know, centering grassroots and frontline leadership, no false solutions, you know, the deeply intersectional nature of the work, and of course, honing in on how this is all really healing work. This is about recovering our humanity, and it was just beautifully stated. So grateful to be a part of this movement with all of you and with all the participants that are also on the line. Before we close out, let's just do one more Zoom poll to see how people feel about this framework after this discussion. And, you know, feel free to be honest. I know that this framework can be a little, you know, a little overwhelming at first, to totally understand. So we're just putting out that poll again after engaging in the dialogue. How clear is your understanding of the Just Transition and Just Recovery framework? And I'll give a few seconds for folks to answer. All right, we can review the results pretty soon. All right, so we have more folks. We definitely have more folks who are very clear and on the mostly clear and somewhat clear side. So at least now no one is not clear at all, which is great. A lot of improvement. Love seeing that. And finally, as a closeout, please go ahead and just type in the chat, you know, one thing you learned in this panel, in this discussion, that you want to take action on or that you want to work on going forward. And as you're doing that, want to say thank you one more time. Have a wonderful rest of the Congreso, and I'll turn it over to Ernesto for final closing.
Yes, thank you for joining our Just Recovery workshop. We will soon be taking a quick 15-minute break before our next event, which is at 12:30 p.m. And it's something we've all been waiting for, our annual EJ Awards. So this is going to be DJ Que Madre's closing set. I know, the tunes have been amazing. But after Congreso, we'll be emailing you her Spotify playlist so you can continue to enjoy her selections of uplifting movement music. So I hope you're able to use this break to grab some lunch, use our virtual photo booth, and enjoy the music. As a reminder, the hashtags are hashtag Congreso 2020, hashtag Just Recovery, and we'll see you all at 12:30 p.m. Thank you, DJ Que Madre.
Hello. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much, Ceja, for having me. I had a really good time hanging out with everybody. Gracias a todos.